The lesbian phallus and the morphological imaginary. The Lacanians desire clearly to separate phallus from penis, to control the meaning of the signifier phallus, is precisely symptomatic of their desire to have the phallus, that is, their desire to be at the center of language, at its origin. And their inability to control the meaning of the word phallus is evidence of what Lacan calls symbolic castration. Jane Gallup, beyond the phallus all sorts of things in the world behave like mirrors. Jacques Lacan, Seminar to Elfter. Such a promising title. I knew that I could not possibly offer a satisfying essay, but perhaps the promise of the phallus is always dissatisfying in some way. I would like, then, to acknowledge that failure from the start and to work that failure for its uses and to suggest that something more interesting than satisfying the phallic ideal may come of the analysis that I propose. Indeed, perhaps a certain wariness with respect to that allure is a good thing. What I would like to do instead is make a critical return to Freud, to his essay on narcissism, an introduction, and consider the textual contradictions he produces as he tries to define the boundaries of erotogenic body parts. It may not seem that the lesbian phallus has much to do with what you are about to read, but I assure you, promise you, that it couldn't have been done without it. The essay on narcissism, an introduction, 1914, is an effort to explain the theory of libido in terms of those experiences which seem at first to be most improbably conducive to its terms. Freud begins by considering bodily pain, and he asks whether we might understand the obsessive self-preoccupations of those who suffer physical illness or injury to be a kind of libidinal investment in pain. And he asks further whether this negative investment in one's own bodily discomfort can be understood as a kind of narcissism. For the moment I want to suspend the question of why it is that Freud chooses illness and then hypochondria as the examples of bodily experience that narcissism describes and, indeed, why it seems that narcissism seems to be negative narcissism from the start. I will, however, return to this question once the relationship between illness and erotogenicity is established. In the essay on narcissism, then, Freud first considers organic disease as that which withdraws libido from love objects, and lavishes libido on itself. As the first in what will become a string of examples, he cites a line of poetry from Wilhelm Busch's Balduin Beblamen on the erotics of the toothache: concentrated is his soul, in his molar's jaw tooth is aching hole. According to the theory of libido, the concentration eroticizes that hole in the mouth, that cavity within a cavity, redoubling the pain of the physical as and through a psychically invested pain, a pain of or from the soul, the psyche. From this example of libidinal self-investment, Freud extrapolates to other examples: sleep and then dreams, both considered as exercises in sustained self-preoccupation, and then to hypochondria. The example of physical pain thus gives way, through a textual detour through sleep, dreams, and the imaginary, to an analogy with hypochondria, and finally to an argument that establishes the theoretical indissolubility of physical and imaginary injury. This position has consequences for determining what constitutes a body part at all, and, as we shall see, what constitutes an erotogenic body part in particular. In the essay on narcissism, hypochondria lavishes libido on a body part, but in a significant sense, that body part does not exist for consciousness prior to that investiture. Indeed, that body part is delineated and becomes knowable for Freud only on the condition of that investiture. 9 years later, in The Ego and the ID, 1923, Freud will state quite clearly that bodily pain is the precondition of bodily self-discovery. In this text he asks how one can account for the formation of the ego, that bounded sense of self, and concludes that it is differentiated from the ID partially through pain. Pain seems to play a part in the process, and the way in which we gain new knowledge of our organs during painful illnesses is perhaps a model of the way by which in general we arrive at the idea of our own body. 25-6. In a move that prefigures Lacan's argument in the mirror stage, Freud connects the formation of one's ego with the externalized idea one forms of one's own body. Hence, Freud's claim, the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. What is meant by the imaginary construction of body parts? Is this an idealist thesis or one which asserts the indissolubility of the psychic and physical body? Curiously, Freud associates the process of erotogenicity with the consciousness of bodily pain. Let us now, taking any part of the body, describe its activity of sending sexually exciting stimuli to the mind as its erotogenicity, Freud 1914. Here, however, it is fundamentally unclear, even undecidable, whether this is a consciousness that imputes pain to the object, thereby delineating it as is the case in hypochondria, or whether it is a pain caused by organic disease which is retrospectively registered by an attending consciousness. This ambiguity between a real and conjured pain, however, is sustained in the analogy with erotogenicity, which seems defined as the very vacillation between real and imagined body parts. If erotogenicity is produced through the conveying of a bodily activity through an idea, then the idea and the conveying are phenomenologically coincident. As a result, it would not be possible to speak about a body part that precedes and gives rise to an idea, for it is the idea that emerges simultaneously with the phenomenologically accessible body, indeed, that guarantees its accessibility. Although Freud's language engages a causal temporality that has the body part precede its idea, he nevertheless confirms here the indissolubility of a body part and the phantasmatic partitioning that brings it into psychic experience. Later, in the first seminar, Lacan will read Freud along these latter lines, arguing in his discussion on the two narcissisms that the libidinal drive is centered on the function of the imaginary. Already in the essay on narcissism, however, we find the beginnings of this latter formulation in the discussion of the erotogenicity of body parts. Directly following his argument in favor of hypochondria as anxiety neurosis, Freud argues that libidinal self-attention is precisely what delineates a body part as a part. Now the familiar prototype vorbula of an organ sensitive to pain, in some way changed and yet not diseased in the ordinary sense, is that of the genital organ in a state of excitation. Freud 1914. Clearly there is an assumption here of a singular genital organ, the sex, which is one, but as Freud continues to write about it, it appears to lose its proper place and proliferate in unexpected locations. This example at first provides the occasion for the definition of erotogenicity I already cited, that activity of a given bodily area which consists in conveying sexually exciting stimuli to the mind. Freud then proceeds to communicate as already accepted knowledge that certain other areas of the body, the erotogenic zones, may act as substitutes for the genitals and behave analogously to them. Freud 1914. Here it seems that the genitals, presumed to be male genitals, are at first an example of body parts delineated through anxiety neurosis, but, as a prototype, they are the example of examples of that process whereby body parts become epistemologically accessible through an imaginary investiture. As an exemplar or prototype, these genitals have already within Freud's text substituted not only for a variety of other body parts or types, but for the effects of other hypochondriacal processes as well. The gaping hole in the mouth, the panoply of organic and hypochondriacal ailments are synthesized in and summarized by the prototypical male genitals. This collapse of substitutions performed by these genitals is, however, reversed and erased in the sentence that follows, in which the erotogenic zones are said to act as substitutes for the genitals. In the latter case, it seems that these self-same genitals, the result or effect of a set of substitutions, are that for which other body parts act as substitutes. Indeed, the male genitals are suddenly themselves an originary site of erotogenization, which then subsequently becomes the occasion for a set of substitutions or displacements. At first, it seems logically incompatible to assert that these genitals are at once a cumulative example and a prototype or originary site which occasions a process of secondary exemplifications. In the first case, they are the effect and sum of a set of substitutions, and in the second, they are an origin for which substitutions exist. But perhaps this logical problem only symptomizes a wish to understand these genitals as an originating idealization, that is, as the symbolically encoded phallus. The phallus, which Freud invokes in the interpretation of dreams, is considered the privileged signifier by Lacan, that which originates or generates significations, but is not itself the signifying effect of a prior signifying chain. To offer a definition of the phallus, indeed, to attempt denotatively to fix its meaning, is to posture as if one has the phallus and, hence, to presume and enact precisely what remains to be explained. In a sense, Freud's essay enacts the paradoxical process by which the phallus as the privileged and generative signifier is itself generated by a string of examples of erotogenic body parts. The phallus is then set up as that which confers erotogenicity and signification on these body parts, although we have seen through the metonymic slide of Freud's text the way in which the phallus is installed as an origin precisely to suppress the ambivalence produced in the course of that slide. If Freud is here endeavoring to circumscribe the phallic function and proposing a conflation of the penis and the phallus, then the genitals would necessarily function in a double way, as the symbolic ideal that offers an impossible and originary measure for the genitals to approximate, and as the imaginary anatomy which is marked by the failure to accomplish that return to that symbolic ideal. Insofar as the male genitals become the site of a textual vacillation, they enact the impossibility of collapsing the distinction between penis and phallus. Note that I have consigned the penis, conventionally described as real anatomy, to the domain of the imaginary. I will pursue the consequences of this consignment or liberation toward the end of this essay. As if foundering amid a set of constitutive ambivalences out of his control, Freud follows his paradoxical articulation of the male genitals as prototype and origin by adding yet another inconsistent claim to the list we can decide to regard. He claims erotogenicity as a general characteristic of all organs and may then speak of an increase or decrease of it in a particular part of the body. Freud 1914. In this last remark, which, it seems, Freud must force himself to make as if pure conviction will issue forth its own truth, reference to the temporal or ontological primacy of any given body part is suspended. To be a property of all organs is to be a property necessary to no organ, a property defined by its very plasticity, transferability, and expropriability. In a sense, we have been following the metonymic chain of this roving property from the start. Freud's discussion began with the line from Wilhelm Busch, "The jaw tooth is aching hole," a figure that stages a certain collision of figures, a punctured instrument of penetration, an inverted vagina dentata, anus, mouth, orifice in general, the specter of the penetrating instrument penetrated. Insofar as the tooth, as that which bites, cuts, breaks through, and enters is that which is itself already entered, broken into, it figures an ambivalence that, it seems, becomes the source of pain, analogized with the male genitals a few pages later. This figure is immediately likened to other body parts in real or imagined pain, and is then replaced and erased by the prototypical genitals. This wounded instrument of penetration can only suffer under the ideal of its own invulnerability, and Freud attempts to restore its imaginary power by installing it first as prototype and then as originary site of erotogenization. In the course of restoring this phallic property to the penis, however, Freud enumerates a set of analogies and substitutions that rhetorically affirm the fundamental transferability of that property. Indeed, the phallus is neither the imaginary construction of the penis nor the symbolic valence for which the penis is a partial approximation. For that formulation is still to affirm the phallus as the prototype or idealized property of the penis. And yet it is clear from the metonymic trajectory of Freud's own text, the ambivalence at the center of any construction of the phallus belongs to no body part, but is fundamentally transferable and is, at least within his text, the very principle of erotogenic transferability. Moreover, it is through this transfer, understood as a substitution of the psychical for the physical or the metaphorizing logic of hypochondria, that body parts become phenomenologically accessible at all. Here we might understand the pain/pleasure nexus that conditions erotogenicity as partially constituted by the very idealization of anatomy designated by the phallus. On this reading, then, Freud's textualized effort to resolve the figure of the jaw tooth as aching hole into the penis as prototype and then as phallus rhetorically enacts the very process of narcissistic investment and idealization that he seeks to document, overcoming that ambivalence through the conjuring of an ideal. One might want to read the psychic idealization of body parts as an effort to resolve a prior, physical pain. It may be, however, that the idealization produces erotogenicity as a scene of necessary failure and ambivalence, one that then prompts a return to that idealization in a vain effort to escape that conflicted condition. To what extent is this conflicted condition precisely the repetitive propulsionality of sexuality? And what does failure to approximate mean in the context in which every body does precisely that? One might also argue that to continue to use the term phallus for this symbolic or idealizing function is to prefigure and valorize which body part will be the site of erotogenization. This is an argument that deserves a serious response. To insist, on the contrary, on the transferability of the phallus as transferable or plastic property, is to destabilize the distinction between being and having the phallus, and to suggest that a logic of non-contradiction does not necessarily hold between those two positions. In effect, the having is a symbolic position which, for Lacan, institutes the masculine position within a heterosexual matrix, and which presumes an idealized relation of property which is then only partially and vainly approximated by those marked masculine beings who vainly and partially occupy that position within language. But if this attribution of property is itself improperly attributed, if it rests on a denial of that property's transferability, i.e., if this is a transfer into a non-transferable site or a site which occasions other transfers, but which is itself not transferred from anywhere, then the repression of that denial will constitute that system internally and, therefore, pose as the promising spectre of its destabilization. Insofar as any reference to a lesbian phallus appears to be a spectral representation of a masculine original, we might well question the spectral production of the putative originality of the masculine. In this sense, Freud's text might be read as the forcible production of a masculinist original in much the same way as Plato's Timaeus was read. In Freud's text, this claim to originality is constituted through a reversal and erasure of a set of substitutions produced in ambivalence. It seems that this imaginary valorization of body parts is to be derived from a kind of eroticized hypochondria. Hypochondria is an imaginary investment which, according to the early theory, constitutes a libidinal projection of the body surface which in turn establishes its epistemological accessibility. Hypochondria here denotes something like a theatrical delineation or production of the body, one which gives imaginary contours to the ego itself, projecting a body which becomes the occasion of an identification which in its imaginary or projected status is fully tenuous. But something is clearly awry in Freud's analysis from the start. For how is it that the self-preoccupation with bodily suffering or illness becomes the analogy for the erotogenic discovery and conjuring of body parts? In the ego and the ID, Freud himself suggests that to figure sexuality as illness is symptomatic of the structuring presence of a moralistic framework of guilt. In this text, Freud argues that narcissism must give way to objects, and that one must finally love in order not to fall ill. Insofar as there is a prohibition on love accompanied by threats of imagined death, there is a great temptation to refuse to love, and so to be taken in by that prohibition and contract neurotic illness. Once this prohibition is installed, then, body parts emerge as sites of punishable pleasure and hence, of pleasure and pain. In this kind of neurotic illness, then, guilt is manifest as pain that suffuses the bodily surface, and can appear as physical illness. What follows, then, if it is this kind of guilt-induced bodily suffering which is, as Freud claimed of other kinds of pain, analogous to the way in which we achieve an idea of our own body? If prohibitions in some sense constitute projected morphologies, then reworking the terms of those prohibitions suggests the possibility of variable projections, variable modes of delineating and theatricalizing body surfaces. These would be ideas of the body without which there could be no ego, no temporary centering of experience. To the extent that such supporting ideas are regulated by prohibition and pain, they can be understood as the forcible and materialized effects of regulatory power. But precisely because prohibitions do not always work, that is, do not always produce the docile body that fully conforms to the social ideal, they may delineate body surfaces that do not signify conventional heterosexual polarities. These variable body surfaces or bodily egos may thus become sites of transfer for properties that no longer belong properly to any anatomy. I'll make almost clear what this means for thinking through alternative imaginaries and the lesbian phallus, but first a cautionary note on Freud. The pathologization of erotogenic parts in Freud calls to be read as a discourse produced in guilt, and although the imaginary and projective possibilities of hypochondria are useful, they call to be dissociated from the metaphorics of illness that pervade the description of sexuality. This is especially urgent now that the pathologization of sexuality generally, and the specific description of homosexuality as the paradigm for the pathological as such, are symptomatic of homophobic discourse on AIDS. Insofar as Freud accepts the analogy between erotogenicity and illness, he produces a pathological discourse on sexuality that allows figures for organic disease to construct figures for erotogenic body parts. This conflation has a long history, no doubt, but it finds one of its contemporary permutations in the homophobic construction of male homosexuality as always already pathological. An argument recently made by Jeff Nunoka was such that AIDS is phantasmatically construed as the pathology of homosexuality itself. Clearly, the point is to read Freud not for the moments in which illness and sexuality are conflated, but, rather, for the moments in which that conflation fails to sustain itself, and where he fails to read himself in precisely the ways he teaches us to read. Commenting on a text is like doing an analysis. Lacan. Prohibitions, which include the prohibition on homosexuality, work through the pain of guilt. Freud offers this link at the end of his essay when he accounts for the genesis of conscience, and its self-policing possibilities, as the introjection of the homosexual cathexis. In other words, the ego ideal which governs what Freud calls the ego's self-respect requires the prohibition on homosexuality. This prohibition against homosexuality is homosexual desire turned back upon itself. The self-beratement of conscience is the reflexive rerouting of homosexual desire. If, then, as Freud contends, pain has a delineating effect, i.e., may be one way in which we come to have an idea of our body at all, it may also be that gender-instituting prohibitions work through suffusing the body with a pain that culminates in the projection of a surface, that is, a sexed morphology which is at once a compensatory fantasy and a fetishistic mask. And if one must either love or fall ill, then perhaps the sexuality that appears as illness is the insidious effect of such a censoring of love. Can the very production of the morph be read as an allegory of prohibited love, the incorporation of loss? The relation between incorporation and melancholy is a complicated one to which we will return in the final chapter. Suffice it to say that the boundaries of the body are the lived experience of differentiation, where that differentiation is never neutral to the question of gender difference or the heterosexual matrix. What is excluded from the body for the body's boundary to form? And how does that exclusion haunt that boundary as an internal ghost of sorts, the incorporation of loss as melancholia? To what extent is the body surface the dissimulated effect of that loss? Freud offers something like a map of this problematic without following through on the analysis that it requires. If this effort to rethink the physical and the psychical works well, then it is no longer possible to take anatomy as a stable referent that is somehow valorized or signified through being subjected to an imaginary schema. On the contrary, the very accessibility of anatomy is in some sense dependent on this schema and coincident with it. As a result of this coincidence, it is unclear to me that lesbians can be said to be of the same sex or that homosexuality in general ought to be construed as of the same. If sex is always schematized in this sense, then there is no necessary reason for it to remain the same for all women. The indissolubility of the psychic and the corporeal suggests that any description of the body, including those that are deemed conventional within scientific discourse, takes place through the circulation and validation of such an imaginary schema. But if the descriptions of the body take place in and through an imaginary schema, that is, if these descriptions are psychically and phantasmatically invested, is there still something we might call the body itself which escapes this schematization? At least two responses can be offered to this question. First, psychic projection confers boundaries and, hence, unity on the body, so that the very contours of the body are sites that vacillate between the psychic and the material. Bodily contours and morphology are not merely implicated in an irreducible tension between the psychic and the material but are that tension. Hence, the psyche is not a grid through which a pregiven body appears. That formulation would figure the body as an ontological in itself which only becomes available through a psyche which establishes its mode of appearance as an epistemological object. In other words, the psyche would be an epistemic grid through which the body is known, but the sense in which the psyche is formative of morphology, that is somaticizing, would be lost. That Kantian formulation of the body requires to be reworked, first, in a more phenomenological register as an imaginary formation and, second, through a theory of signification as an effect and token of sexual difference. As for the phenomenological sense, which is sustained in the second, we might understand the psyche in this context as that which constitutes the mode by which that body is given, the condition and contour of that givenness. Here the materiality of the body ought not to be conceptualized as a unilateral or causal effect of the psyche in any sense that would reduce that materiality to the psyche or make of the psyche the monistic stuff out of which that materiality is produced and or derived. This latter alternative would constitute a clearly untenable form of idealism. It must be possible to concede and affirm an array of materialities that pertain to the body, that which is signified by the domains of biology, anatomy, physiology, hormonal and chemical composition, illness, age, weight, metabolism, life, and death. None of this can be denied. But the undeniability of these materialities in no way implies what it means to affirm them. Indeed, what interpretive matrices condition enable and limit that necessary affirmation? That each of those categories have a history and a historicity, that each of them is constituted through the boundary lines that distinguish them and, hence, by what they exclude, that relations of discourse and power produce hierarchies and overlappings among them and challenge those boundaries, implies that these are both persistent and contested regions. We might want to claim that what persists within these contested domains is the materiality of the body. But perhaps we will have fulfilled the same function, and opened up some others, if we claim that what persists here is a demand in and for language, a that which prompts and occasions, say, within the domain of science, calls to be explained, described, diagnosed, altered, or within the cultural fabric of lived experience, fed, exercised, mobilized, put to sleep, a site of enactments and passions of various kinds. To insist upon this demand, this site, as that without which no psychic operation can proceed, but also as that on which and through which the psyche also operates, is to begin to circumscribe that which is invariably and persistently the psyche's site of operation, not the blank slate or passive medium upon which the psyche acts, but, rather, the constitutive demand that mobilizes psychic action from the start, that is that very mobilization, and, in its transmuted and projected bodily form, remains that psyche. How, then, to answer the second requirement to cast the notion of bodies as a matter of signification? Are bodies purely discursive? The linguistic categories that are understood to denote the materiality of the body are themselves troubled by a referent that is never fully or permanently resolved or contained by any given signified. Indeed, that referent persists only as a kind of absence or loss, that which language does not capture, but, instead, that which impels language repeatedly to attempt that capture, that circumscription, and to fail. This loss takes its place in language as an insistent call or demand that, while in language, is never fully language. To posit a materiality outside of language is so to posit that materiality, and the materiality so posited will retain that positing as its constitutive condition. To posit a materiality outside of language, where that materiality is considered ontologically distinct from language, is to undermine the possibility that language might be able to indicate or correspond to that domain of radical alterity. Hence the absolute distinction between language and materiality which was to secure the referential function of language undermines that function radically. This is not to say that, on the one hand, the body is simply linguistic stuff or, on the other, that it has no bearing on language. It bears on language all the time. The materiality of language, indeed, of the very sign that attempts to denote materiality, suggests that it is not the case that everything, including materiality, is always already language. On the contrary, the materiality of the signifier, a materiality that comprises both signs and their significatory efficacy, implies that there can be no reference to a pure materiality except via materiality. Hence, it is not that one cannot get outside of language in order to grasp materiality in and of itself, rather, every effort to refer to materiality takes place through a signifying process which, in its phenomenality, is always already material. In this sense, then, language and materiality are not opposed, for language both is and refers to that which is material, and what is material never fully escapes from the process by which it is signified. But if language is not opposed to materiality, neither can materiality be summarily collapsed into an identity with language. On the one hand, the process of signification is always material, signs work by appearing, visibly, orally, and appearing through material means, although what appears only signifies by virtue of those non-phenomenal relations, i.e., relations of differentiation, that tacitly structure and propel signification itself. Relations, even the notion of difference, institute and require relata, terms, phenomenal signifiers. And yet what allows for a signifier to signify will never be its materiality alone, that materiality will be at once an instrumentality and deployment of a set of larger linguistic relations. The materiality of the signifier will signify only to the extent that it is impure, contaminated by the ideality of differentiating relations, the tacit structurings of a linguistic context that is illimitable in principle. Conversely, the signifier will work to the extent that it is also contaminated constitutively by the very materiality that the ideality of sense purports to overcome. Apart from and yet related to the materiality of the signifier is the materiality of the signified as well as the referent approached through the signified, but which remains irreducible to the signified. This radical difference between referent and signified is the site where the materiality of language and that of the world which it seeks to signify are perpetually negotiated. This might usefully be compared with Merleau-Ponty's notion of the flesh of the world. Although the referent cannot be said to exist apart from the signified, it nevertheless cannot be reduced to it. That referent, that abiding function of the world, is to persist as the horizon and the that which makes its demand in and to language. Language and materiality are fully embedded in each other, chiasmic in their interdependence but never fully collapsed into one another, i.e., reduced to one another, and yet neither fully ever exceeds the other, always already implicated in each other, always already exceeding one another. Language and materiality are never fully identical nor fully different, but what then do we make of the kind of materiality that is associated with the body, its physicality as well as its location, including its social and political locatedness, and that materiality that characterizes language? Do we mean materiality, in a common sense, or are these usages examples of what Althusser refers to as modalities of matter? To answer the question of the relation between the materiality of bodies and that of language requires first that we offer an account of how it is that bodies materialize, that is, how they come to assume the morphe, the shape by which their material discreteness is marked. The materiality of the body is not to be taken for granted, for in some sense it is acquired, constituted, through the development of morphology. And within the Lacanian view, language, understood as rules of differentiation based on idealized kinship relations, is essential to the development of morphology. Before we consider one account of the development of linguistic and corporeal morphology, let us turn briefly to Kristeva, to provide a contrast with Lacan, and a critical introduction. Insofar as language might be understood to emerge from the materiality of bodily life, that is, as the reiteration and extension of a material set of relations, language is a substitute satisfaction, a primary act of displacement and condensation. Kristeva argues that the materiality of the spoken signifier, the vocalization of sound, is already a psychic effort to reinstall and recapture a lost maternal body, hence, these vocalizations are temporarily recaptured in sonorous poetry which works language for its most material possibilities. Even here, however, those material sputtings are already psychically invested, deployed in the service of a fantasy of mastery and restoration. Here the materiality of bodily relations, prior to any individuation into a separable body or, rather, simultaneous with it, is displaced onto the materiality of linguistic relations. The language that is the effect of this displacement nevertheless carries the trace of that loss precisely in the phantasmatic aim of recovery that mobilizes vocalization itself. Here, then, it is the materiality of that other body which is phantasmatically reinvoked in the materiality of signifying sounds. Indeed, what gives those sounds the power to signify is that phantasmatic structure. The materiality of the signifier is thus the displaced repetition of the materiality of the lost maternal body. In this sense, materiality is constituted in and through iterability. And to the extent that the referential impulse of language is to return to that lost originary presence, the maternal body becomes as it were, the paradigm or figure for any subsequent referent. This is in Pan the function of the real in its convergence with the unthematizable maternal body in Lacanian discourse. The real is that which resists and compels symbolization. Whereas the real remains unrepresentable within Lacanian doctrine, and the spectre of its representability is the spectre of psychosis, Kristeva redescribes and reinterprets what is outside the symbolic as the semiotic, that is, as a poetic mode of signifying that, although dependent on the symbolic, can neither be reduced to it not figured as its unthematizable other. For Kristeva, the materiality of language is in some sense derived from the materiality of infantile bodily relations. Language becomes something like the infinite displacement of that jouissance that is phantasmatically identified with the maternal body. Every effort to signify encodes and repeats this loss. Moreover, it is only on the condition of this primary loss of the referent, the real, understood as the maternal presence, that signification and the materialization of language can take place. The materiality of the maternal body is only figurable within language, a set of already differentiated relations, as the phantasmatic site of a de-individuated fusion, jouissance prior to the differentiation and emergence of the subject. But insofar as this loss is figured within language, i.e., appears as a figure in language, that loss is also denied, for language both performs and defends against the separation that it figures. As a result, any figuration of that loss will both repeat and refuse the loss itself. The relations of differentiation between parts of speech which produce signification are themselves the reiteration and extension of the primary acts of differentiation and separation from the maternal body by which a speaking subject comes into being. Insofar as language appears to be motivated by a loss it cannot grieve, and to repeat the very loss that it refuses to recognize, we might regard this ambivalence at the heart of linguistic iterability as the melancholy recesses of signification. The postulation of the primacy of the maternal body in the genesis of signification is clearly questionable, for it cannot be shown that a differentiation from such a body is that which primarily or exclusively inaugurates the relation to speech. The maternal body prior to the formation of the subject is always and only known by a subject who by definition postdates that hypothetical scene. Lacan's effort to offer an account of the genesis of bodily boundaries in The Mirror Stage, 1949, takes the narcissistic relation as primary, and so displaces the maternal body as a site of primary identification. This happens within the essay itself when the infant is understood to overcome with jubilation the obstruction of the support which presumably holds the infant in place before the mirror. The reification of maternal dependency as a support and an obstruction signified primarily as that which, in the overcoming, occasions jubilation, suggests that there is a discourse on the differentiation from the maternal in the mirror stage. The maternal is, as it were, already put under erasure by the theoretical language which reifies her function and enacts the very overcoming that it seeks to document. Insofar as the mirror stage involves an imaginary relation, it is that of psychic projection, but not, strictly speaking, in the register of the symbol IC, i.e., in language, the differentiated slashing use of speech. The mirror stage is not a developmental account of how the idea of one's own body comes into being. It does suggest, however, that the capacity to project a morph, a shape, onto a surface is part of the psychic, and phantasmatic, elaboration, centering, and containment of one's own bodily contours. This process of psychic projection or elaboration implies as well that the sense of one's own body is not, only, achieved through differentiating from another, the maternal body, but that any sense of bodily contour, as projected, is articulated through a necessary self-division and self-estrangement. In this sense, Lacan's mirror stage can be read as a rewriting of Freud's introduction of the bodily ego and the id, as well as the theory of narcissism. Here it is not a question of whether the mother or the imago comes first or whether they are fully distinct from one another, but, rather, how to account for individuation through the unstable dynamics of sexual differentiation and identification that take place through the elaboration of imaginary bodily contours. For Lacan, the body or, rather, morphology is an imaginary formation, but we learn in the second seminar that this percipi or visual production, the body, can be sustained in its phantasmatic integrity only through submitting to language and to a marking by sexual difference. The percipi of man, sic, can only be sustained within a zone of nomination, say par la nomination que vi hum fait subsister les objets dans un certain consistence f. Lacan. Bodies only become whole, i.e., totalities, by the idealizing and totalizing specular image which is sustained through time by the sexually marked name. To have a name is to be positioned within the symbolic, the idealized domain of kinship, a set of relationships structured through sanction and taboo which is governed by the law of the father and the prohibition against incest. For Lacan, names, which emblematize and institute this paternal law, sustain the integrity of the body. What constitutes the integral body is not a natural boundary or organic telos, but the law of kinship that works through the name. In this sense, the paternal law produces versions of bodily integrity. The name, which installs gender and kinship, works as a politically invested and investing performative. To be named is thus to be inculcated into that law and to be formed, bodily, in accordance with that law. Rewriting the morphological imaginary consciousness occurs each time there is a surface such that it can produce what is called an image. That is a materialist definition. Lacan, there is something originally, inaugurally, profoundly wounded in the human relation to the world. That is what comes out of the theory Freud gave us, insofar as this framework introduces an indefinable, a no exit, marking all relations, and especially the libidinal relations of the subject. Lacan. The following selective reading of Lacan will explore the consequences of the theory of narcissism for the formation of the bodily ego and its marking by sex. Insofar as the ego is formed from the psyche through projecting the body, and the ego is that projection, the condition of reflexive, knowing, it is invariably a bodily ego. This projection of the body, which Lacan narrates as the mirror stage, rewrites Freud's theory of narcissism through the dynamics of projection and misrecognition, mechanisance. In the course of that rewriting, Lacan establishes the morphology of the body as a psychically invested projection, an idealization or fiction of the body as a totality and locus of control. Moreover, he suggests that this narcissistic and idealizing projection that establishes morphology constitutes the condition for the generation of objects and the cognition of other bodies. The morphological scheme established through the mirror stage constitutes precisely that reserve of morph from which the contours of objects are produced. Both objects and others come to appear only through the mediating grid of this projected or imaginary morphology. This Lacanian trajectory will be shown to become problematic on, at least, 2 counts. 1. The morphological scheme which becomes the epistemic condition for the world of objects and others to appear is marked as masculine, and, hence, becomes the basis for an anthropocentric and androcentric epistemological imperialism. This is one criticism of Lacan offered by Luce Irigaray and supplies the compelling reason for her project to articulate a feminine imaginary, and, 2, the idealization of the body as a center of control sketched in the mirror stage is re-articulated in Lacan's notion of the phallus as that which controls significations in discourse, in The Signification of the Phallus, 1958. Although Lacan explicitly denounces the possibility that the phallus is a body part or an imaginary effect, that repudiation will be read as constitutive of the very symbolic status he confers on the phallus in the course of the later essay. As an idealization of a body part, the phantasmatic figure of the phallus within Lacan's essay undergoes a set of contradictions similar to those which unsettled Freud's analysis of erotogenic body parts. The lesbian phallus may be said to intervene as an unexpected consequence of the Lacanian scheme, an apparently contradictory signifier which, through a critical mimesis, calls into question the ostensibly originating and controlling power of the Lacanian phallus, indeed, its installation as the privileged signifier of the symbolic order. The move emblematized by the lesbian phallus contests the relationship between the logic of non-contradiction and the legislation of compulsory heterosexuality at the level of the symbolic and bodily morphogenesis. Consequently, it seeks to open up a discursive site for reconsidering the tacitly political relations that constitute and persist in the divisions between body parts and wholes, anatomy and the imaginary, corporeality and the psyche. In his seminar of 1953, Lacan argued that the mirror stage is not simply a moment in development, it also has an exemplary function, because it reveals some of the subject's relations to his image, insofar as it is the urbild of the ego. Lacan. In The Mirror Stage, published 4 years earlier, Lacan argues that we have to understand the mirror stage as an identification, and then slightly later in the essay suggests that the ego is the cumulative effect of its formative identifications. Within the American reception of Freud, especially in ego psychology and certain versions of object relations, it is perhaps customary to suggest that the ego pre-exists its identifications, a notion confirmed by the grammar that insists that an ego identifies with an object outside itself. The Lacanian position suggests not only that identifications precede the ego, but that the identificatory relation to the image establishes the ego. Moreover, the ego established through this identificatory relation is itself a relation, indeed, the cumulative history of such relations. As a result, the ego is not a self-identical substance, but a sediment history of imaginary relations which locate the center of the ego outside itself, in the externalized imago which confers and produces bodily contours. In this sense, Lacan's mirror does not reflect or represent a pre-existing ego, but, rather, provides the frame, the boundary, the spatial delineation for the projective elaboration of the ego itself. Hence, Lacan claims, the image of the body gives the subject the first form which allows him to locate what pertains to the ego qui est dum and what does not. Lacan. Strictly speaking, then, the ego cannot be said to identify with an object outside itself, rather, it is through an identification with an imago, which is itself a relation, that the outside of the ego is first ambiguously demarcated, indeed, that a spatial boundary that negotiates outside and inside is established in and as the imaginary. The function of the mirror stage is a particular case of the function of the imago, which is to establish a relation between the organism and its reality or, as they say, between the Innenwelt and the Umwelt, the specular image that the child sees, that is, the imagining that the child produces, confers a visual integrity and coherence on his own body, appearing as other, which compensates for his limited and pre-specular sense of motility and undeveloped motor control. Lacan goes on to identify this specular image with the ego ideal ideal, and with the subject, although these terms will in his later lectures be distinguished from one another on other grounds. Significantly, this idealized totality that the child sees is a mirror image. One might say that it confers an ideality and integrity on his body, but it is perhaps more accurate to claim that the very sense of the body is generated through this projection of ideality and integrity. Indeed, this mirroring transforms a lived sense of disunity and loss of control into an ideal of integrity and control, la puissance, through that event of specularization. Shortly, we will argue that this idealization of the body articulated in the mirror stage reemerges unwittingly in the context of Lacan's discussion of the phallus as the idealization and symbolization of anatomy. At this point, it is perhaps enough to note that the imago of the body is purchased through a certain loss. Libidinal dependency and powerlessness is phantasmatically overcome by the installation of a boundary and, hence, a hypostasized center which produces an idealized bodily ego. That integrity and unity is achieved through the ordering of a wayward motility or disaggregated sexuality not yet restrained by the boundaries of individuation. The human object objet humain always constitutes itself through the intermediary of a first loss. Nothing fruitful takes place in man rien de condamné lu pour l'homme save through the intermediary of a loss of an object. Lacan. Lacan remarks in the second seminar that the body in pieces le corps morciel finds its unity in the image of the other, which is its own anticipate image, a dual situation in which a polar, but non-symmetrical relation, is sketched out. Lacan. The ego is formed around the specular image of the body itself, but this specular image is itself an anticipation, a subjunctive delineation. The ego is first and foremost an object which cannot coincide temporally with the subject, a temporal castasts the ego's temporal futurity, and its exteriority as a percipi establish its alterity to the subject. But this alterity is ambiguously located, first, within the circuit of a psyche which constitutes/finds the ego as a mistaken and disinterring token of itself, hence, an interior alterity, second, as an object of perception, like other objects, and so at a radical epistemic distance from the subject. The ego is a particular object within experience of the subject. Literally, the ego is an object which fills a certain function which we here call the imaginary function. Lacan. As imaginary, the ego as object is neither interior nor exterior to the subject, but the permanently unstable site where that spatialized distinction is perpetually negotiated. It is this ambiguity that marks the ego as imago, that is, as an identificatory relation. Hence, identifications are never simply or definitively made or achieved, they are insistendi constituted, contested, and negotiated. The specular image of the body itself is in some sense the image of the other. But it is only on the condition that the anticipated, ambiguously located body furnishes an imago and a boundary for the ego that objects come into perception. The object is always more or less structured as the image of the body of the subject. The reflection of the subject, its mirror stage image speculaire, is always found somewhere in every perceptual picture tableau perceptif, and that is what gives it a quality, a special inertia, Lacan. Here we not only have an account of the social constitution of the ego, but the modes by which the ego is differentiated from its other, and how that imago that sustains and troubles that differentiation at the same time generates objects of perception. On the libidinal level, the object is only even apprehended through the grid of the narcissistic relation, Lacan. And this is made all the more complex when we see that the reflexive relation to / of the ego is always ambiguously related to a relation to the other. Far from being a merely narcissistic precondition of object genesis, this claim offers instead an irreducible equivocation of narcissism and sociality which becomes the condition of the epistemological generation of and access to objects. The idealization of the body as a spatially bounded totality, characterized by a control exercised by the gaze, is lent out to the body as its own self-control. This will become crucial to the understanding of the phallus as a privileged signifier that appears to control the significations that it produces. Lacan suggests as much in the second seminar. The issue is knowing which organs come into play in Intrant and Judith's the narcissistic imaginary relation to the other whereby the ego is formed, Bildet. The imaginary structuration of the ego forms around the specular image of the body itself, of the image of the other, Lacan. But some parts of the body become the tokens for the centering and controlling function of the bodily imago. Certain organs are caught up in sunt interests dans the narcissistic relation, insofar as it structures both the relation of the ego to the other and the constitution of the world of objects, Lacan. Although these organs are not named, it seems that they are, first of all, organs lay organs and that they enter into play in the narcissistic relation. They are that which act as the token or conjectured basis for narcissism. If these organs are the male genitals, they function as both the site and token of a specifically masculine narcissism. Moreover, insofar as these organs are set into play by a narcissism which is said to provide the structure of relations to the other and to the world of objects, then these organs become part of the imaginary elaboration of the ego's bodily boundary, token and proof of its integrity and control, and the imaginary epistemic condition of its access to the world. By entering into that narcissistic relation, the organs cease to be organs and become imaginary effects. One might be tempted to argue that in the course of being set into play by the narcissistic imaginary, the penis becomes the phallus. And yet, curiously and significantly, in Lacan's essay on the signification of the phallus, he will deny that the phallus is either an organ or an imaginary effect. It is instead a privileged signifier. We will turn to the textual knots that those series of denials produce in Lacan's essay, but here it is perhaps important to note that these narcissistically engaged organs become part of the condition and structure of every object and other that can be perceived. What did I try to get across with the mirror stage? The image of man's body is the principle of every unity he perceives in objects. All the objects of his world are always structured around the wandering shadow of his own ego. Say toujours auteur de iamber errante de son propre motke structure errant tous les objets de son monde, Lacan. This extrapolating function of narcissism becomes phallogocentrism at the moment in which the aforementioned organs, engaged by the narcissistic relation, become the model or principle by which any other object or other is known. At this point, the organs are installed as a privileged signifier. Within the orbit of this emerging phallogocentrism, Verliethiat being in love is fundamentally narcissistic. On the libidinal level, the object is only even apprehended through the grid of the narcissistic relation la grille du rapport narcissique, Lacan. Lacan claims that the organs are taken up by a narcissistic relanon, and that this narcissistically invested anatomy becomes the structure, principle, the grid of all epistemic relations. In other words, it is the narcissistically imbued organ which is then elevated to a structuring principle which forms and gives access to all knowable objects. In the first place, this account of the genesis of epistemological relations implies that all knowable objects will have an anthropomorphic and androcentric character. Secondly, this androcentric character will be phallic. At this juncture it makes sense to consider the relation between the account of specular relations in the mirror stage, the argument that morphology preconditions epistemological relations, and the later move in the signification of the phallus, which asserts that the phallus is a privileged, signifies the differences between the language and aims of the two essays are marked. The earlier essay concerns epistemological relations which are not yet theorized in terms of signification. The latter appears to have emerged after a shift from epistemological to significatory models, or, rather, an embedding of the epistemological within the symbolic domain of signification. And yet, there is another difference here, one which might be understood as a reversal. In the earlier essay, the organs are taken up by the narcissistic relation and become the phantasmatic morphology which generates, through a specular extrapolation, the structure of knowable objects. In the later essay, Lacan introduces the phallus which functions as a privileged signifier and delimits the domain of the signifiable. In a limited sense, the narcissistically invested organs in the mirror stage serve a function parallel to that of the phallus in the signification of the phallus. The former establish the conditions for knowability, the latter establish the conditions for signifiability. Further, the theoretical context in which the signification of the phallus occurs is one in which signification is the condition of all knowability, and the image can be sustained only by the sign, the imaginary within the terms of the symbolic. It appears to follow that the narcissistically invested organs in the former essay are in some way maintained in and by the notion of the phallus. Even if we were to argue that the mirror stage documents an imaginary relation, whereas the signification of the phallus is concerned with signification at the level of the symbolic, it is unclear whether the former can be sustained without the latter and, perhaps more significantly, the latter, i.e., the symbolic, without the former. And yet this logical conclusion is thwarted by Lacan himself in his insistence that the phallus is neither an anatomical part nor an imaginary relation. Is this repudiation of the anatomical and imaginary origins of the phallus to be read as a refusal to account for the very genealogical process of idealizing the body that Lacan himself provided in the mirror stage? Are we to accept the priority of the phallus without questioning the narcissistic investment by which an organ, a body part, has been elevated/erected to the structuring and centering principle of the world? If the mirror stage * reveals how through the synecdochal function of the imaginary, parts come to stand for wholes and a disintegrated body is transfigured into a totality with a center, then we might be led to ask which organs perform this centering and synecdochal function. The signification of the phallus effectively refuses the question that the former essay implicitly raised. For if the phallus in its symbolic function is neither an organ nor an imaginary effect, then it is not constructed through the imaginary, and maintains a status and integrity independent of it. This corresponds, of course, to the distinction that Lacan makes throughout his work between the imaginary and the symbolic. But if the phallus can be shown to be a synecdochal effect, if it both stands for the part, the organ, and is the imaginary transfiguration of that part into the centering and totalizing function of the body, then the phallus appears as symbolic only to the extent that its construction through the transfigurative and specular mechanisms of the imaginary is denied. Indeed, if the phallus is an imaginary effect, a wishful transfiguration, then it is not merely the symbolic status of the phallus that is called into question, but the very distinction between the symbolic and the imaginary. If the phallus is the privileged signifier of the symbolic, the delimiting and ordering principle of what can be signified, then this signifier gains its privilege through becoming an imaginary effect that pervasively denies its own status as both imaginary and an effect. If this is true of the signifier that delimits the domain of the signifiable within the symbolic, then it is true of all that is signified as the symbolic. In other words, what operates under the sign of the symbolic may be nothing other than precisely that set of imaginary effects which have become naturalized and reified as the law of signification. The mirror stage and the signification of the phallus follow, at least, two very different narrative trajectories. The first follows the premature and imaginary transformation of a disintegrated body, a body in pieces le corps morcial, into the specular body, a morphological totality invested with a center of motor control. The second follows the differential accession of bodies to sexed positions within the symbolic. In the one instance, there is narrative recourse to a body before the mirror, in the other, a body before the law. Such a discursive reference is one which, within Lacan's own terms, is to be construed less as a developmental explanation than as a necessary heuristic fiction. In the mirror stage, that body is figured in pieces en image morcili du corps, in Lacan's discussion of the phallus, the body and anatomy are described only through negation. Anatomy and, in particular anatomical parts, are not the phallus, but only that which the phallus symbolizes. Tu est encore bien pnoins I organe, penis ou clitoris, quil symbolize. In the former essay, then, shall we call it a piece, Lacan narrates the overcoming of the partitioned body through the specular and phantasmatic production of a morphological whole. In the latter essay, that drama is enacted or symptomatized by the narrative movement of the theoretical performance itself, what we will consider briefly as the performativity of the phallus. But if it is possible to read the signification of the phallus as symptomatizing the specular phantasm described in the mirror stage, it is also possible, and useful, to reread the mirror stage as offering an implicit theory of mirroring as a signifying practice. If the body is in pieces before the mirror, it follows that the mirroring works as a kind of synecdochal extrapolation by which those pieces or parts come to stand, in and by the mirror, for the whole, or, put differently, the part substitutes for the whole and thereby becomes a token for the whole. If this is right, then perhaps the mirror stage proceeds through a synecdochal logic that institutes and maintains a phantasm of control. It makes sense to ask, then, whether the theoretical construction of the phallus is such a synecdochal extrapolation. By changing the name of the penis to the phallus, is the part status of the former phantasmatically and synecdochally overcome through the inauguration of the latter as the privileged signifier? And does this name, like proper names, secure and sustain the morphological distinctness of the masculine body, sustaining the percipi through nomination? In Lacan's discussion of what the phallus is, to be distinguished from his discussion of who is the phallus, he quarrels with various psychoanalytic practitioners about who is entitled to name the phallus, who knows where and how the name applies, who is in the position to name the name. He objects to the relegation of the phallus to a phallic stage or to the conflation and diminution of the phallus to a partial object. Lacan faults Karl Abraham in particular for introducing the notion of the partial object, but it is clear that he is most strongly opposed to Melanie Klein's theory of introjected body parts and with Ernest Jones's influential acceptance of these positions. Lacan associates the normalization of the phallus as partial object with the degradation of psychoanalysis on American soil, ou la dégradation de la psychanalyse, consecutive sa transplantation americani, Lacan. Other theoretical tendencies associated with this degradation are termed culturalist and feminist in particular. He is opposed to those psychoanalytic positions which consider the phallic phase to be an effect of repression, and the phallic object as a symptom. Here the phallus is negatively defined through a string of attributes, not partial, not an object, not a symptom. Moreover, the not which precedes each of these attributes is not to be read as a refoulement, repression. In other words, negation in these textual instances is not to be read psychoanalytically, Lacan. How, then, can we read the symptomatic dimension of Lacan's text here? Does the rejection of the phallic phase and, in particular, of the figuration of the phallus as a partial or approximative object, seek to overcome a degradation in favor of an idealization, a specular one? Do these psychoanalytic texts fail to mirror the phallus as specular center, and do they threaten to expose the synecdochal logic by which the phallus is installed as privileged signifier? If the position for the phallus erected by Lacan symptomatizes the specular and idealizing mirroring of a disintegrated body in pieces before the mirror, then we can read here the phantasmatic rewriting of an organ or body part, the penis, as the phallus, a move effected by a transvaluative denial of its substitutability, dependency, diminutive size, limited control, partiality. The phallus would then emerge as a symptom, and its authority could be established only through a metaleptic reversal of cause and effect. Rather than the postulated origin of signification or the signifiable, the phallus would be the effect of a signifying chain summarily suppressed. But this analysis still needs to take into account why it is that the body is in pieces before the mirror and before the law. Why should the body be given in parts before it is specularized as a totality and center of control? How did this body come to be in pieces and parts? To have a sense of a piece or a part is to have in advance a sense for the whole to which they belong. Although the mirror stage attempts to narrate how a body comes to have a sense of its own totality for the first time, the very description of a body before the mirror as being in parts or pieces takes as its own precondition an already established sense of a whole or integral morphology. If to be in pieces is to be without control, then the body before the mirror is without the phallus, symbolically castrated, and by gaining specularized control through the ego constituted in the mirror, that body assumes or comes to have the phallus. But the phallus is, as it were, already in play in the very description of the body in pieces before the mirror. As a result, the phallus governs the description of its own genesis and, accordingly, wards off a genealogy that might confer on it a derivative or projected character. Although Lacan claims quite explicitly that the phallus is not an imaginary effect, that denial might be read as constitutive of the very formation of the phallus as privileged signifier. That denial appears to facilitate that privileging. As an imaginary effect, the phallus would be as disintegrate and tenuous as the ego. In an effort to recenter and ground the phallus is elevated to the status of the privileged signifier, and it is offered at the end of a long list of improper usages for the term, ways in which the term has gotten out of hand, signified where it ought not to have, and in ways that are wrong. The phallus is not a fantasy, if what is understood by that is an imaginary effect. Nor is it an object, part, internal, good, bad, etc., in so far as this term tends to accentuate the reality involved in a relationship. It is even less the organ, penis, or clitoris, which it symbolizes. And it is not by accident that Freud took his reference for it from the simulacrum which it represented for the ancients. For the phallus is a signifier. Rose in this last pronouncement, Lacan seeks to relieve the term of its cat-acrestic wanderings, to re-establish the phallus as a site of control, as that which is to designate as a whole the effect of their being a signified, and hence to position Lacan himself as the one to control the meaning of the phallus. As Jane Gallup has argued, to cite her is perhaps to transfer the phallus from him to her, but also then affirms my point that the phallus is fundamentally transferable, and their inability to control the meaning of the word phallus is evidence of what Lacan calls symbolic castration. If not being able to control the significations that follow from the signifier phallus is evidence of symbolic castration, then the body in pieces and out of control before the mirror may be understood as symbolically castrated, and the specular and synecdochal idealization of the phallic body may be read as a compensatory mechanism by which this phantasmatic castration is overcome. Not unlike Freud's efforts to put a stop to the proliferation of erotogenic body parts in his text, parts which were also sites of pain, Lacan stalls the sliding of the signifier into a proliferative catachresis through a preemptive assertion of the phallus as privileged signifier. To claim for the phallus the status of a privileged signifier performatively produces and affects this privilege. The announcement of that privileged signifier is its performance. That performative assertion produces and enacts the very process of privileged signification, one whose privilege is potentially contested by the very list of alternatives it discounts, and the negation of which constitutes and precipitates that phallus. Indeed, the phallus is not a body part, but the whole, is not an imaginary effect, but the origin of all imaginary effects. These negations are constitutive. They function as disavowals that precipitate and are then erased by the idealization of the phallus. The paradoxical status of the negation that introduces and institutes the phallus becomes clear in the grammar itself. Ui est encore moins I organe, penis ou clitoris, chu il symbolize. Here the sentence suggests that the phallus, even less than an imaginary effect, is not an organ. Here Lacan thus suggests gradations of negation. The phallus is more likely to be an imaginary effect than an organ. If it is either one, it is more of an imaginary effect than an organ. This is not to say that it is not at all an organ, but that the copula that which asserts a linguistic and ontological identity is the least adequate way of expressing the relation between them. In the very sentence in which the minimization of any possible identity between penis and phallus is asserted, an alternative relation between them is offered, namely, the relation of symbolization. The phallus symbolizes the penis, and insofar as it symbolizes the penis, retains the penis as that which it symbolizes. It is not the penis. To be the object of symbolization is precisely not to be that which symbolizes. To the extent that the phallus symbolizes the penis, it is not that which it symbolizes. The more symbolization occurs, the less ontological connection there is between symbol and symbolized. Symbolization presumes and produces the ontological difference between that which symbolizes or signifies and that which is symbolized or signified. Symbolization depletes that which is symbolized of its ontological connection with the symbol itself. But what is the status of this particular assertion of ontological difference if it turns out that this symbol, the phallus, always takes the penis as that which it symbolizes? What is the character of this bind whereby the phallus symbolizes the penis to the extent that it differentiates itself from the penis, where the penis becomes the privileged referent to be negated? If the phallus must negate the penis in order to symbolize and signify in its privileged way, then the phallus is bound to the penis, not through simple identity, but through determinate negation. If the phallus only signifies to the extent that it is not the penis, and the penis is qualified as that body part that it must not be, then the phallus is fundamentally dependent upon the penis in order to symbolize it all. Indeed, the phallus would be nothing without the penis. And in that sense in which the phallus requires the penis for its own constitution, the identity of the phallus includes the penis, that is, a relation of identity holds between them. And this is, of course, not only a logical point, for we have seen that the phallus not only opposes the penis in a logical sense, but is itself instituted through the repudiation of its partial, disentaired, and substitutable character. The question, of course, is why it is assumed that the phallus requires that particular body part to symbolize, and why it could not operate through symbolizing other body parts. The viability of the lesbian phallus depends on this displacement or, to put it more accurately, the displaceability of the phallus, its capacity to symbolize in relation to other body parts or other body-like things, opens the way for the lesbian phallus, an otherwise contradictory formulation. And here it should be clear that the lesbian phallus crosses the orders of having and being, it both wields the thread of castration, which is in that sense a mode of being the phallus, as women are, and suffers from castration anxiety, and so is said to have the phallus, and to fear its loss. To suggest that the phallus might symbolize body parts other than the penis is compatible with the Lacanian scheme. But to argue that certain body parts or body-like things other than the penis are symbolized as having the phallus is to call into question the mutually exclusive trajectories of castration anxiety and penis envy. Indeed, if men are said to have the phallus symbolically, their anatomy is also a site marked by having lost it. The anatomical part is never commensurable with the phallus itself. In this sense, men might be understood to be both castrated, already, and driven by penis envy, more properly understood as phallus envy. Conversely, insofar as women might be said to have the phallus and fear its loss, and there is no reason why that could not be true in both lesbian and heterosexual exchange, raising the question of an implicit heterosexuality in the former, and homosexuality in the latter, they may be driven by castration anxiety. Although a number of theorists have suggested that lesbian sexuality is outside the economy of phallogocentrism, that position has been critically countered by the notion that lesbian sexuality is as constructed as any other form of sexuality within contemporary sexual regimes. Of interest here is not whether the phallus persists in lesbian sexuality as a structuring principle, but how it persists, how it is constructed, and what happens to the privileged status of that signifier within this form of constructed exchange. I am not arguing that lesbian sexuality is only or even primarily structured by the phallus, or even that such an impossible monolith as lesbian sexuality exists. But I do want to suggest that the phallus constitutes an ambivalent site of identification and desire that is significantly different from the scene of normative heterosexuality to which it is related. If Lacan claimed that the phallus only operates as veiled, we might ask in return what kind of veiling the phallus invariably performs. And what is the logic of veiling and, hence, of exposure that emerges within lesbian sexual exchange in relation to the question of the phallus? Clearly, there is no single answer, and the kind of culturally textured work that might approximate an answer to this question will doubtless need to take place elsewhere. Indeed, the lesbian phallus is a fiction, but perhaps a theoretically useful one, for there are questions of imitation, subversion, and the recirculation of phantasmatic privilege that a psychoanalytically informed reading might attend. If the phallus is that which is excommunicated from the feminist orthodoxy on lesbian sexuality as well as the missing part, the sign of an inevitable dissatisfaction that is lesbianism in homophobic and misogynist constructions, then the admission of the phallus into that exchange faces two convergent prohibitions. First, the phallus signifies the persistence of the straight mind, a masculine or heterosexist identification and, hence, the defilement or betrayal of lesbian specificity. Secondly, the phallus signifies the insuperability of heterosexuality and constitutes lesbianism as a vain and or pathetic effort to mime the real thing. Thus, the phallus enters lesbian sexual discourse in the mode of a transgressive confession, conditioned and confronted by both the feminist and misogynist forms of repudiation. It's not the real thing, the lesbian thing, or it's not the real thing, the straight thing. What is unveiled is precisely the repudiated desire, that which is abject by heterosexist logic and that which is defensively foreclosed through the effort to circumscribe a specifically feminine morphology for lesbianism. In a sense, what is unveiled or exposed is a desire that is produced through a prohibition. And yet, the phantasmatic structure of this desire will operate as a veil precisely at the moment in which it is revealed. That phantasmatic transfiguration of bodily boundaries will not only expose its own tenuousness, but will turn out to depend on that tenuousness and transience in order to signify it all. The phallus as signifier within lesbian sexuality will engage the specter of shame and repudiation delivered by that feminist theory which would secure a feminine morphology in its radical distinctness from the masculine, a binarism that is secured through heterosexual presumption, a specter delivered in a more pervasive way by the masculinist theory which would insist on the male morphology as the only possible figure for the human body. Traversing those divisions, the lesbian phallus signifies a desire that is produced historically at the crossroads of these prohibitions, and is never fully free of the normative demands that condition its possibility and that it nevertheless seeks to subvert. Insofar as the phallus is an idealization of morphology, it produces a necessary effect of inadequation, one which, in the cultural context of lesbian relations, can be quickly assimilated to the sense of an inadequate derivation from the supposedly real thing, and, hence, a source of shame. But precisely because it is an idealization, one which no body can aid quaddly approximate, the phallus is a transferable phantasm, and its naturalized link to masculine morphology can be called into question through an aggressive reterritorialization. That complex identificatory fantasies inform morphogenesis, and that they cannot be fully predicted, suggests that morphological idealization is both a necessary and unpredictable ingredient in the constitution of both the bodily ego and the dispositions of desire. The straight mind, a masculine or heterosexist identification and, hence, the defilement or betrayal of lesbian specificity. Secondly, the phallus signifies the insuperability of heterosexuality and constitutes lesbianism as a vain and or pathetic effort to mime the real thing. Thus, the phallus enters lesbian sexual discourse in the mode of a transgressive confession, conditioned and confronted by both the feminist and misogynist forms of repudiation. It's not the real thing, the lesbian thing, or it's not the real thing, the straight thing. What is unveiled is precisely the repudiated desire, that which is abject by heterosexist logic and that which is defensively foreclosed through the effort to circumscribe a specifically feminine morphology for lesbianism. In a sense, what is unveiled or exposed is a desire that is produced through a prohibition. And yet, the phantasmatic structure of this desire will operate as a veil precisely at the moment in which it is revealed. That phantasmatic transfiguration of bodily boundaries will not only expose its own tenuousness, but will turn out to depend on that tenuousness and transience in order to signify it all. The phallus as signifier within lesbian sexuality will engage the specter of shame and repudiation delivered by that feminist theory which would secure a feminine morphology in its radical distinctness from the masculine, a binarism that is secured through heterosexual presumption, a specter delivered in a more pervasive way by the masculinist theory which would insist on the male morphology as the only possible figure for the human body. Traversing those divisions, the lesbian phallus signifies a desire that is produced historically at the crossroads of these prohibitions, and is never fully free of the normative demands that condition its possibility and that it nevertheless seeks to subvert. Insofar as the phallus is an idealization of morphology, it produces a necessary effect of inadequation, one which, in the cultural context of lesbian relations, can be quickly assimilated to the sense of an inadequate derivation from the supposedly real thing, and, hence, a source of shame. But precisely because it is an idealization, one which no body can aid quaddly approximate, the phallus is a transferable phantasm, and its naturalized link to masculine morphology can be called into question through an aggressive reterritorialization. That complex identificatory fantasies inform morphogenesis, and that they cannot be fully predicted, suggests that morphological idealization is both a necessary and unpredictable ingredient in the constitution of both the bodily ego and the dispositions of desire. It also means that there is not necessarily one imaginary schema for the bodily ego, and that cultural conflicts over the idealization and degradation of specific masculine and feminine morphologies will be played out at the site of the morphological imaginary in complex and conflicted ways. It may well be through a degradation of a feminine morphology, an imaginary and cathected degrading of the feminine, that the lesbian phallus comes into play, or it may be through a castrating occupation of that central masculine trope, fueled by the kind of defiance which seeks to overturn that very degradation of the feminine. It is important to underscore, however, the way in which the stability of both masculine and feminine morphologies is called into question by a lesbian resignification of the phallus which depends on the crossings of phantasmatic identification. If the morphological distinctness of the feminine depends on its purification of all masculinity, and if this bodily boundary and distinctness is instituted in the service of the laws of a heterosexual symbolic, then that repudiated masculinity is presumed by the feminized morphology, and will emerge either as an impossible ideal that shadows and thwarts the feminine or as a disparaged signifier of a patriarchal order against which a specific lesbian feminism defines itself. In either case, the relation to the phallus is constitutive, an identification is made which is at once disavowed. Indeed, it is this disavowed identification that enables and informs the production of a distinct feminine morphology from the start. It is doubtless possible to take account of the structuring presence of cross-identifications in the elaboration of the bodily ego, and to frame these identifications in a direction beyond a logic of repudiation by which one identification is always and only worked at the expense of another. For the shame of the lesbian phallus presumes that it will come to represent the truth of lesbian desire, a truth which will be figured as a falsehood, a vain imitation or derivation from the heterosexual norm. And the counter-strategy of confessional defiance presumes as well that what has been excluded from dominant sexual discourses on lesbianism thereby constitutes its truth. But if the truth is, as Nietzsche suggests, only a series of mistakes configured in relation to one another or, in Lacanian terms, a set of constituting mechanescences, then the phallus is but one signifier among others in the course of lesbian exchange, neither the originating signifier nor the unspeakable outside. The phallus will thus always operate as both veil and confession, a deflection from an erotogenicity that includes and exceeds the phallus, an exposure of a desire which attests to a morphological transgression and, hence, to the instability of the imaginary boundanes of sex. Conclusion: if the phallus is an imaginary effect, which is reified as the privileged signifier of the symbolic order, then its structural place is no longer determined by the logical relation of mutual exclusion entailed by heterosexist version of sexual difference in which men are said to have and women to be the phallus. This logical and structural place is secured through the move that claims that by virtue of the penis, one is symbolized as having, that structural bond, or bind, secures a relation of identity between the phallus and the penis that is explicitly denied. It also performs a synecdochal collapse of the penis and the one who has it. If the phallus only symbolizes to the extent that there is a penis there to be symbolized, then the phallus is not only fundamentally dependent upon the penis, but cannot exist without it. But is this true? K. If the phallus operates as a signifier whose privilege is under contest, if its privilege is shown to be secured precisely through the reification of logical and structural relations within the symbolic, then the structures within which it is put into play are more various and revisable than the Lacanian scheme can affirm. Consider that having the phallus can be symbolized by an arm, a tongue, a hand, or two, a knee, a thigh, a pelvic bone, an array of purposefully instrumentalized body-like things. And that this having exists in relation to a being the phallus which is both part of its own signifying effect, the phallic lesbian as potentially castrating, and that which it encounters in the woman who is desired, as the one who, offering or withdrawing the specular guarantee, wields the power to castrate. That this scene can reverse, that being and having can be confounded, upsets the logic of non-contradiction that serves the either-or of normative heterosexual exchange. In a sense, the simultaneous acts of deprivileging the phallus and removing it from the normative heterosexual form of exchange and recirculating and reprivileging it between women deploys the phallus to break the signifying chain in which it conventionally operates. If a lesbian has it, it is also clear that she does not have it in the traditional sense. Her activity furthers a crisis in the sense of what it means to have one at all. The phantasmatic status of having is redelineated, rendered transferable, substitutable, plastic, and the eroticism produced within such an exchange depends on the displacement from traditional masculinist contexts as well as the critical redeployment of its central figures of power. Clearly, the phallus operates in a privileged way in contemporary sexual cultures, but that operation is secured by a linguistic structure or position that is not independent of its perpetual reconstitution. Inasmuch as the phallus signifies, it is also always in the process of being signified and resignified. In this sense, it is not the incipient moment or origin of a signifying chain, as Lacan would insist, but part of a writerable signifying practice and, hence, open to resignification, signifying in ways and in places that exceed its proper structural place within the Lacanian symbolic and contest the necessity of that place. If the phallus is a privileged signifier, it gains that privilege through being reiterated. And if the cultural construction of sexuality compels a repetition of that signifier, there is nevertheless in the very force of repetition, understood as resignification or recirculation, the possibility of deprivileging that signifier. If what comes to signify under the sign of the phallus are a number of body parts, discursive performatives, alternative fetishes, to name a few, then the symbolic position of having has been dislodged from the penis as its privileged anatomical, or non-anatomical, occasion. The phantasmatic moment in which a part suddenly stands for and produces a sense of the whole or is figured as the center of control, in which a certain kind of phallic determination is made by virtue of which meaning appears radically generated, underscores the very plasticity of the phallus, the way in which it exceeds the structural place to which it has been consigned by the Lacanian scheme, the way in which that structure, to remain a structure, has to be reiterated and, as writerable, becomes open to variation and plasticity. When the phallus is lesbian, then it is and is not a masculinist figure of power. The signifier is significantly split, for it both recalls and displaces the masculinism by which it is impelled. And insofar as it operates at the site of anatomy, the phallus, produces the spectre of the penis only to enact its vanishing, to reiterate and exploit its perpetual vanishing as the very occasion of the phallus. This opens up anatomy and sexual difference itself as a site of proliferative resignifications. In a sense, the phallus as I offer it here is both occasioned by Lacan and exceeds the purview of that form of heterosexist structuralism. It is not enough to claim that the signifier is not the same as the signified, phallus/penis, if both terms are nevertheless bound to each other by an essential relation in which that difference is contained. The offering of the lesbian phallus suggests that the signifier can come to signify in excess of its structurally mandated position. Indeed, the signifier can be repeated in contexts and relations that come to displace the privileged status of that signifier. The structure by which the phallus signifies the penis as its privileged occasion exists only through being instituted and reiterated and, by virtue of that temporalization, is unstable and open to subversive repetition. Moreover, if the phallus symbolizes only through taking anatomy as its occasion, then the more various and unanticipated the anatomical, and non-anatomical, occasions for its symbolization, the more unstable that signifier becomes. In other words, the phallus has no existence separable from the occasions of its symbolization, it cannot symbolize without its occasion. Hence, the lesbian phallus offers the occasion, a set of occasions, for the phallus to signify differently, and in so signifying, to resignify, unwittingly, its own masculinist and heterosexist privilege. The notion of the bodily ego in Freud and that of the projective idealization of the body in Lacan suggest that the very contours of the body, the delimitations of anatomy, are in part the consequence of an externalized identification. That identificatory process is itself motivated by a transfigurative wish. And that wishfulness proper to all morphogenesis is itself prepared and structured by a culturally complex signifying chain that not only constitutes sexuality, but establishes sexuality as a site where bodies and anatomies are perpetually reconstituted. If these central identifications cannot be strictly regulated, then the domain of the imaginary in which the body is partially constituted is marked by a constitutive vacillation. The anatomical is only given through its signification, and yet it appears to exceed that signification, to provide the elusive referent in relation to which the variability of signification performs. Always already caught up in the signifying chain by which sexual difference is negotiated, the anatomical is never given outside its terms, and yet it is also that which exceeds and compels that signifying chain, that reiteration difference, an insistent and inexhaustible demand. If the heterosexualization of identification and morphogenesis is historically contingent, however hegemonic, then identifications, which are always already imaginary, as they cross gender boundaries, reinstitute sexed bodies in variable ways. In crossing these boundaries, such morphogenetic identifications reconfigure the mapping of sexual difference itself. The bodily ego produced through identification is not mimetically related to a pre-existing biological or anatomical body. That former body could only become available through the imaginary schema I am proposing here, so that we would be immediately caught up in an infinite regress or vicious circle. The body in the mirror does not represent a body that is, as it were, before the mirror, even as it is instigated by that unrepresentable body before the mirror, produces that body as its delirious effect, a delirium, by the way, which we are compelled to live. In this sense, to speak of the lesbian phallus as a possible site of desire is not to refer to an imaginary identification and/or desire that can be measured against a real one. On the contrary, it is simply to promote an alternative imaginary to a hegemonic imaginary and to show, through that assertion, the ways in which the hegemonic imaginary constitutes itself through the naturalization of an exclusionary heterosexual morphology. In this sense, it is important to note that it is the lesbian phallus and not the penis that is considered here. For what is needed is not a new body part,